Atari, the once great company that was once the most important in history, was founded in 1972. Its early video games, made on arcade machines, became icons. But today, we're not going to talk about that or its origins. Today, we'll focus on all the problems the company faced, its fall, its rise, and finally, its demise. Atari's history is a complex tapestry woven with both innovation and missteps. While they were trailblazers in the realm of arcade games, their trajectory was marred by flawed strategies that ultimately paved the road to failure. Their inaugural venture into the world of video games birthed the iconic Pong. However, even in its genesis, Atari made a series of questionable decisions that would foreshadow their future pitfalls. They opted to exploit the Pong brand to exhaustion, prioritizing short-term profit over long-term sustainability, laying the groundwork for the much-criticized modern-day practice of milking franchises dry. In 1972, Atari found themselves entangled in a legal quagmire due to their lackluster creation, Space Race. Developed in collaboration with Midway, under contractual obligation, they churned out a boring, uninspired game, a mere checkbox ticked rather than a labor of passion. This led to their first legal entanglement as they recycled elements from a previous title, Asteroid, prompting Midway to sever their ties and reclaim control of their intellectual property. Atari, however, remained undeterred, their focus unwavering, fixed on the pursuit of profit margins rather than ethical conduct. Their dubious practices extended beyond mere legal wrangling. Atari birthed Key Games, a purported competitor that was in fact a subsidiary totally owned by Atari. This thinly veiled ruse allowed Atari to monopolize the market, dictating terms and reaping profits with impunity, a Machiavellian tactic that left smaller developers floundering in the wake. As the landscape of home console gaming evolved, Atari found themselves outpaced and outgunned by competitors like the Channel console, boasting superior capabilities and a diverse library of games. Faced with dwindling resources and a desperate need to remain relevant, Nolan Bushnell, Atari's visionary founder, made the fateful decision to relinquish control, selling the company to Warner for a hefty sum of $28 million. Yet this act of financial desperation would prove to be a double-edged sword, exchanging autonomy for fleeting financial solvency, setting Atari on a collision course with its own demise. With the promise of a revolutionary new system, Atari began development of what would become known as the Atari VCS, later renamed the Atari 2600. It was released in 1977 and not a success in any sense of the word, as the console wasn't worth it, as the era had passed and nobody wanted to play Pong games anymore. The sales of the console began to drop immediately, reaching minimal quantities of less than 1,000 sales, which caused internal tensions between Warner and Atari's leaders. The situation reached a critical point when the dispute between Warner and Bushnell escalated to where the latter was forced to leave the company. This internal division and mistrust weakened Atari's position in the marketplace and left the company vulnerable to future challenges. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy and its demise was imminent, but in 1979, a savior arrived, none other than Warren Robinett, who had been working on a secret project for computers called Adventure, which was not just another arcade game, but the first computer adventure game to challenge the limitations of a single screen, allowing players to explore a vast virtual world. It marked a significant moment in the history of video games, something that would change the way they were established and a huge opportunity for Atari to recover after years of decline. So they would start distributing them in a way that worked out quite well. Not to mention that at the same time, licenses for hits like Atari Space Invaders contributed to an exponential increase in sales, reaching 2 million units sold in 1980. Even the venerable Atari 2600 received an upgrade, cementing its iconic status in the collective memory of gamers. With this outlook, things were going well for Atari, as it continued to work in the market during those years, achieving a great boom in many areas, bringing a new group of teams for a new generation of home computers. The first computers, the Atari 400 and 800, launched in 1979, with each number representing the amount of RAM within, and they were praised by critics for their innovation and performance. These machines not only offered more power, but also opened the door to a new world of possibilities for computer enthusiasts and gamers. Atari's rise continued over the years with a series of innovations and releases that solidified its position as a leader in the entertainment industry. Eventually, the company experienced its growth. But how did Atari become synonymous with quality and fun for millions of people worldwide? At least, that was their primary goal. because from that point on, things would not go so smoothly, as everyone would witness their imminent downfall. One of the first blows was the release of the Atari 5200 in 1982, which was poorly received by the public for not offering anything interesting. They tried to promote it as an improved version of the successful Atari 2600. The 5200 had improved graphics and an advanced controller. However, its lack of compatibility with the 2600's extensive game library and its limited selection of titles itself didn't help. Despite attempts to correct its mistakes with a second model of the 5200 and plans for the Atari 5100, the company continued to lose ground in an increasingly competitive market. Meanwhile, Atari ventured into the production of new computers, such as the Atari 1200 XL, hoping to revive its business. However, these efforts proved futile, as the machines themselves didn't offer much improvements over previous models like the Atari 800. Manufacturing problems and high production costs exacerbated the situation, causing Atari to lose its market leadership. Despite desperate attempts to launch new computers like the Atari 600 XL and 800 XL, the company failed to recover. Fierce competition from brands like Commodore and a lack of strategic vision ultimately sealed Atari's fate. Finally, in an attempt to salvage what was left of the company, Warner decided to sell Atari's computer and video game console divisions in 1984. The buyer, Jack Tramiel, a Holocaust survivor and former owner of Commodore, took over the operations. But legal and financial problems persisted, and Atari continued its descent into irrelevance. And that was just the beginning, as things weren't looking good in terms of competitiveness. Nintendo was leading the way. It was an era of competition and a desperate fight for rights, not to mention it was the middle of the Cold War. One of Nintendo's strongest elements was the release of Tetris on the Game Boy. After the launch of the Atari Jaguar, the company struggled to stay afloat in an increasingly competitive market. Despite its tag as the first 64-bit console, the Jaguar failed to achieve the expected success. Atari's poor reputation and lack of third-party support contributed to its demise. The situation worsened with the introduction of competing consoles such as the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, which offered a superior gaming experience and a larger game library. This was devastating for the company, which desperately tried to keep the Atari Jaguar relevant by releasing the Atari Jaguar CD. However, their efforts were in vain, as consumer disinterest and confusion about the true capabilities of the 64-bit console contributed to its failure. As Atari struggled to stay afloat in the home console market, they also ventured into the handheld console market with the Atari Lynx. Despite the innovative features such as the backlighting and the ability to connect multiple devices, the Lynx couldn't compete with the dominance of the Nintendo Game Boy, especially with the juggernaut that was Tetris, a blow that marked a complete shift in the market. The release of the Atari Lynx 2, with hardware improvements and better battery life, felt more like a desperate attempt to revive the console, but unfortunately, Atari had started a war it would, once again, lose. Atari's computer division couldn't escape the financial and strategic problems that plagued the company. Despite attempts to reinvent itself with models like the Atari ST and the Atari portfolio, the company continued to struggle to maintain relevance in a market dominated by names like Commodore and Apple. Eventually, the company was forced to seek refuge under the wings of other companies such as Hasbro and Infogrames in a desperate attempt to survive. Although Atari still retains its place in history as one of the pioneers of the video game industry, its downfall was a mixture of very poor decisions from the start, seeking only to sell in every sense of the word. Atari was one of the greatest companies in video games to date, a behemoth of what could be created at the time, but it wasn't smart enough to preserve itself in history, and unfortunately fell into darkness. Still, it was one of the pioneers and arguably one of the most important. But what do you think? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Thanks for watching.